Greetings, part 2, the West. Hegel and Hollywood Westerns. This is what you've been waiting for. You're a no-good, low-down Yankee. Who's that? I'll tell you at the end. Who is that? It's a famous quote from a famous film from a famous actor. Okay, who is it? You're a no-good, low-down Yankee. In the last video, I hopefully explained the influence of Protestantism and Fichte and the Enlightenment and what they had on the minds of the settlers who colonized and shaped the American West. So we're going to come next video about colonization and colonialism. I tried to explain how the law and the absence of law was just as important a feature of the American landscape as the open range was for the white pioneers. How is this linked to Hegel and forgiveness? Explain that for Hegel, forgiveness is a human act, spiritual act. And again, this is a discussion on spirit. In Hegel world, forgiveness sublates. It overcomes the natural fact of revenge with a reconciliation of judging consciousness and acting consciousness. The themes of law and revenge are the major features of every Western, apart from modern ones. Every traditional Western, every single one, that's the theme. So as explained in the last video, I had a compulsory cowboys and Indian childhood phase when all the kids in the street were, acting out, playing these type of games. But by the age of 12 at the latest, maybe even younger, I got bored, and we all got bored of Westerns. And I think kids stopped playing these type of games based on Western films, and I don't think they play them anymore, do they? In the 1970s England, the idea of epic revenge and lawlessness, it lost its popularity. So in my view, that's when the war film, like based on World War II, that also lost its appeal then. So World War II films and Westerns were popular because they reflected the popular morality of the zeitgeist of its time. So morality in these films were black and white. The Nazis, versus our guys. Or the sheriff at Tombstone and the outlaws. These were pretty straightforward things. And I think post-war, where Nazism had just been defeated, it was that kind of morality was black and white morality. It was easy to identify that in a film. Okay, so the great Hegelian insight is that morality is never absolute. It's always contingent upon history. And the problem is, lots of people from a Marxist background is they're not historical enough. History goes so far and then stops. That's why, for example, lots of Marxists, they just quote up to 1848. Karl Marx said this, and then nothing develops. So anyway, that's by the by. Okay, so the Western film genre ended in the 70s when I was a kid, but it had a resurgence. I think it was about 12, 13. I remember going into school and some of my mates, I've got a mate, Joey Marnie, and he used to say, have you seen that? I'd had to go to bed early, right? But I managed to see bits of them, spaghetti westerns, okay? And the older traditional westerns with their clear and apparently simplistic view of good and evil, they disappeared. And the spaghetti westerns, like the good, the bad and the ugly, they're basically amoral gun battles. But they were popular to the not post-war teenage people, but people born in the 60s and the 70s who were growing up then and watching these films, the spaghetti westerns. They were just amoral films. Traditional westerns, the best of them, hold out the possibility of forgiveness. Not necessarily total forgiveness, but the possibility is there. However, naive people might think this is, but the spaghetti westerns, in the spaghetti westerns, cunning and ruthlessness win out over everything else. For example, in Once Upon a Time in the West, the archetypal Hollywood good guy and cowboy good guy, Henry Fonda, who was in My Darling Clementine as a paragon of virtue, he's cast as a sadistic monster. A Fistful of Dollars is, again, it's completely amoral. There's no possibility of reconciliation, only the annihilation of your enemy. Revisionist Westerns, of course, there's that brand, and then revisionist Westerns. And revisionist Westerns, like Little Big Man, Soldier Blue, they turn the genre on its head by transforming the white American protagonist, hero, into the villain. So these were postmodern films. So it doesn't mean that they were bad, or I'm saying that the traditional Hollywood Western was good. I'm saying that it's about morality and how morality was expressed in that. So they left the good and bad behind because obviously, clearly people had come to an historical reckoning with that previous period. And nuance had replaced the straightforward good versus evil as well. That's probably the most important feature I want to identify today. So young children didn't really act out spaghetti westerns because there was no really good and bad. You couldn't be, you could be a cowboy and Indian like that, but you couldn't be Clint Eastwood as a child because it was just amoral. And it's funny, but kids tend to have a sort of morality where you're the goodies and the baddies, whereas there's no goodies and baddies there, just the toughest ones. And they couldn't act out the revisionist westerns because these films were about challenging the category. They were about bringing a new postmodern category into being. And you can't play act irony as a child. So whatever the faults, I've got a small challenge for you. Watch a traditional Western again. So do it tonight or the weekend or whenever, and make sure it's a good one. So whatever its faults, you'll be struck by this implicit moral structure, and it's a message that speaks to our age. And why does it speak to our age? Because conflict between democracies and dictatorships is more acute, and it's more common now than it has been since World War II, since the end of World War II. And the space to be a peacenik or an ironic, amoral, skeptical observer, that's grown smaller. I speak, by the way, as a former peacenik, an ironic, skeptical observer, distant observer. So we're going to come to the question of Native Americans and colonization. So that's still part of the story, but later. But in this series of videos, Westerns, with all their faults, and leaving aside the question of colonization for next time, so please watch the next one. Westerns illustrate this section of phenomenology because this section of the book is about forgiveness. And let's look at some examples. Okay, I've got a quote from Scar, which I won't mention now. Start with the worst Western first, okay. So, the gunfight at the OK Corral. Burt Lancaster, and he's Wyatt Earp, and Kirk Douglas as Doc Holliday. So it's not a great Western, it's not even a good one, it's bang average. It's a cartoon strip version of America and the American West. And it's only really one step away from goodies wearing white hats and baddies wearing black ones. So you got Burt Lancaster as Wyatt Earp, and he's very self-righteous. Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster, thank you. And Kirk Douglas calls him a preacher, while Kate Fisher, she calls Burt Lancaster Mr. Virtue and said that his halo is what he's wearing is too tight. So the moral of the film is about founding the rule of law in the face of lawlessness. So, despite the mediocrity of the film, the Western message is consistent. So remember, I'm not talking about artistic merit, but about the zeitgeist, about the popular mood. Okay, so I say take any Western. So, the same story about Wyatt Earp's done much better in a film called My Darling Clementine. And Henry Fonda, who I've said plays the psychopath in the spaghetti Western, he plays Wyatt Earp. And he is described by a commentator as noble a hero as ever appeared in a Western, incorruptible and honest, tough yet shy and nervous around Clementine. He doesn't smoke and seldom drinks. So Clementine, it's better than the gunfight at the OK Corral. But again, I just like doing Burt Lancaster. Burt Lancaster. Okay, it's better than the gunfight at the OK Corral, but they both share this clear black and white moral vision of against lawlessness. So, when Hollywood began making Westerns in the early 20th century, there was an overlap between the real West and the West on screen. And experienced lawmen and even outlaws acted as technical advisors. And John Ford, who was the par excellence director of the Western, he knew the real Wyatt Earp so well that he was a pallbearer at Wyatt Earp's funeral. Apparently he had like a gun, he had his gun and all kinds of paraphernalia in his house. Stagecoach, which is a John Ford Western, is a story about human perseverance against the backdrop of an Apache tribe on the warpath. The Apache again represents nature. The Apaches are both nature within us and without. And their role as natives tie them to the landscape of the West, and so much so that the two are almost indistinguishable. Stagecoach is filmed in Monument Valley, and its natural vastness makes its opposite, which is the human, seem small and fragile. So if you look at the pictures, Stagecoach is tiny, and Monument Valley, of course, is huge. And it's chosen, Monument Valley and the landscape of the film is chosen not only for its beauty, but its savage beauty. It's nature untouched by human hands, and the mountains tower over the tiny humans. And actually, sometimes, as I said, they look like ants, the humans in the film. So the Apaches at the same time presented as an alien, hostile, like nature. But Apaches also human, because they represent, as I said, the human within us. And that's the savagery that's in common that humans all share. And we're all capable of. And capable of, we can say, the 21st century. So similarly to Stagecoach, John Ford filmed at Monument Valley when he made My Darling Clementine. And this film is set in actually the town of Tombstone. So there's a famous monument. It's called, in Monument Valley there's a peak called East Mitten Butte or Butte, B-U-T-T-E. And that looks an awful lot like a tombstone as well during the film. So it's also useful to note that the townspeople of Tombstone and its capitalist class were largely Republican, and Republicans from the northern states, while the ranchers, like the Clantons, were Confederate sympathizers and nominally Democrats. So again, we've got this theme of Protestant capitalism pushing law for law and order against a different set of values. So in Red River, a wagon train is wiped out by Native Americans, and the film is about moving cattle across country, facing the perils of nature, rivers, rain, dust, stampedes, native attacks, and so on. And all of these phenomena should be classified as natural or quasi-natural events. Again, the film is about humans trying to impose their will upon hostile nature. The film, High Noon, is set in New Mexico, and Marshal Will Kane, played by Gary Cooper, is retiring from his job as a lawman because he's marrying Amy Fowler, who's played by Grace Kelly. So she's a Quaker and she opposes all violence. So there are no Native Americans here, and it's not really about nature without. So the opposition is between nature within, the nature within us, between law and lawlessness within the settler community. So Kane, Gary Cooper, he's supposed to retire from being a lawman on the day of his wedding. That's the condition that Amy gives to Kane, because according to her pacifist beliefs, she can't marry someone who uses violence, however legitimate that violence may be. So they're leaving to set up a store in another town. Meanwhile, news arrives that 3 outlaws are waiting to join up with the main villain, Frank Miller, at the train station. Do not forsake me, oh my darling. Miller, he's a killer, and he previously had the run of the town, and Kane had put him in jail only for him to be released. The new marshal isn't due to arrive until the next day, so Kane decides to stay and confront Frank Miller. Because Kane's breaking his promise, Amy's pacifist beliefs lead her to tell Kane that she's going to leave town and going to leave him. She heads for the station to catch the train, which is the same train that Frank Miller is arriving on. Kane realizes that Miller's return will be the end for the town. It really means the end of the rule of law and civilized life. Nobody's going to back Kane up. Everyone lets him down. His deputy, the former sheriff, even his friends. And the villain of the film, The villain of the film turns out to be the people of the town of Hadleyville, who decide to abandon their lawman. And why did they decide to do this? To pursue their own private interests, their own bourgeois interests. So law and order, although it is a product and it's a necessary precondition of bourgeois society, sometimes it comes into conflict with the egotism of bourgeois society. So we can say with Elon Musk and people like that, but also it comes into conflict with the forces that created it. Anyway, Kane is a lawman. He's not in the same mould as the private detectives of the Raymond Chandler novels. So the Chandler detective, they do the right thing even when nobody is looking. Raymond Chandler hero detectives are straight out of Immanuel Kant. Okay, so they make their moral choices and do the right thing in private. So remember, previous video about the beautiful soul, Immanuel Kant said, do the right thing, all circumstances, do it when no one is looking, that's the important thing. So in High Noon, on the other hand, everyone's thoughts and actions are out in the open, just like a Shakespeare play. There are no secrets in the town, apart from one man who says to his wife, I'm not in, to avoid the fight. Kane's motives are to make a public display of the law. And it seems like a moral choice, and it is a moral choice, but it's not just a matter of personal morality for Kane. Amy represents personal morality, and so it's flawed. It's inadequate. Kane, on the other hand, he's a public and not a private figure, and he publicly states the necessity for law, and not law in the abstract, because he explains what the absence of law will mean when Miller returns. Because then you'll see the rule of violence. So for Kane, who's lived his life according to the law, this wouldn't only be the end of his life morally. It's not just, oh, I'll go and the town's going to be in, shit street. Frank Miller would inevitably track him down and kill him. So the rule of law and personal self-interest go hand in hand. And therefore, it's not like some kind of, it's not a Raymond Chandler drama. And we don't have this inner monologue in the film because we don't need one. Everyone tells Kane to his face to leave, but he can't. The whole time people in the church hall go, they tell him to go. He can't do it because not only his life has been that of a public defender, but he also wants to stay alive. And the best way to do it is by upholding the law. And eventually, Kane defeats Miller, plot spoiler, and the other outlaws, but with the help of Amy, who abandons her pacifism to join the final violent but victorious struggle in support of Kane. For me, this is a relevant political fable. That's why morality is conditional and, time dependent. So I like to look at it like this. Kane is Ukraine. He could do nothing else but fight. And his best defense is the rule of law. Amy's the pacifist, Stop the War coalition, who changes her mind. And the citizens of Hadleyville are like the NATO countries who ignore the threat of the outlaws. And Frank Miller and his gang are Putin's Russia, okay? It's all there. That's why I said about the West. That's why I kind of like the Western. I've fallen in love with it again. Okay, so in Shane, the film Shane, the eponymous hero arrives in a valley at the Starrett Ranch, run by Joe and Marion, with their young boy Joey, right? The homesteaders are being pushed out by cattlemen, the Riker brothers. The opening scene has Joe Starrett. He's chopping wood in the middle of an empty, endless landscape of mountains, plains, rivers, and it's just waiting to be civilized. Okay. Shane, who's played by Alan Ladd, says, I didn't expect to find any fences around here. Do you like these? So Shane's a former outlaw, and he's dead touchy with his guns, isn't he? When little Joey says to him, he has his toy gun, Shane reaches for his gun, he's very touchy. But Shane's a former outlaw, and he recognises the fence as a civilizing influence. So he's more relaxed. The homesteaders are being driven out and terrorized one by one by the Rikers. Eventually, Shane kills the cattleman, the outlaw gang, and he rids the valley of guns, and he helps bring law and civilization to the West. It's a brilliant film, one of my favourites. John Ford's The Searchers is based upon a real event, the kidnap of Cynthia Ann Parker by Comanches in 1836. A large number of settlers were killed by the Native Americans in a raid, and Cynthia was taken, aged 9. The story of The Searchers is about how John Wayne's character, Ethan Edwards, hunts down the Comanches that killed his relatives and kidnapped Lucy Edwards, the Cynthia Parker character. Again, the film is in Monument Valley, and here's a nice quote. Ford's West is a desolate, lonely land where receiving 2 letters in a year is cause for celebration. The life of the homesteaders offers only hardship with scant reward. Of the 2 families depicted in the film, one is wiped out by Comanches and the other lose their son. The theme again is one of revenge, but Ethan's desire for revenge, which fuels a pathological hatred towards Native Americans, right? That's what the film's about. And when he discovers that Lucy has become a native, she's become a squaw, he resolves to complete his revenge by killing Lucy. So it's killing his own family is also conquering its revenge, pure, straightforward revenge. Here's an excerpt from the film script that was written. So the flap is thrust, this is part of The Searchers. The flap is thrust aside and Scar steps out. The Comanche we had seen at the grave when Debbie was captured. He stands tall, arrogant, eyeing the white men with hard, implacable eyes. He has a robe gathered around him. Across his face is a scar. The white man's eyes are as hard as the Comanches. This is the man they have long sought for. The killer, the raper. They cannot mask the hatred they feel. So that's from the film script. So the native chief, cicatrice or scar, describes his motives in a very revealing part of the film. He actually says his family were killed by the settlers, and thus he reveals how he's trapped in this cycle of revenge like John Wayne is. So he says, 2 sons killed by white men. For each son, I take many scalps. So that's the philosophy, not the philosophy, that's not a philosophy, that's nature taking its own course. Reaction, counter-reaction, the same as the cowboys. And remember that the cycle of revenge, I've got to say, it's not a human phenomenon, it's natural, according to Hegel. Revenge is nature's way. Revenge is the law of an equal and opposite reaction to every action, and Scar cannot escape the savage logic of revenge. Ethan kills Scar in battle, and in the final moments, he intends to make his revenge complete by killing Lucy. Or is it Debbie? Anyway, he's going to kill the last one. But he changes his mind. It's Lucy. Yeah. No, it's not Lucy. It's Debbie. He's going to kill Debbie. So he changes his mind. He breaks the natural cycle by not completing his revenge, and he doesn't kill Lucy. Although the real Lucy, whose name is Cynthia Parker, she proudly remained with the Comanches and spoke for the Comanches. The fiction of the film is an illustration of the Hegelian concept of forgiveness. So just forget for a moment the truth. It's just about how people communicated through film and how people understood themselves through film. So this is about breaking the cycle of revenge. Ethan, he doesn't exactly embrace forgiveness, but he ends this natural cycle by making a decision to forgive and accept Lucy back into the family, very grumpily. This is important because Ethan himself is an outlaw, because he kills a villain called Futterman by shooting him in the back. So being an outlaw makes him part of nature, just like Scar. But, you know, Ford doesn't explain why he makes this choice, why John Wayne, Ethan makes this choice. I mean, maybe he doesn't have to. Maybe that's sort of, just looking in his face is enough. You know, if you were to describe it, it would like ruin the film. So Ethan takes the human way out, and that's, of course, it's a Hollywood ending for you, and these are bourgeois endings, and many great westerns are indeed about the founding of, as I said, modern bourgeois, law-abiding, property-owning market economies. They ask the questions of under what conditions a capitalist legal order is possible and how they can come into existence. And as I said before, we all know this is a mythical West. The question that's posed in story form is something that the great philosophers like Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, they were all asking these questions. And I've got to say, the best Westerns, despite their fabulous storytelling, are far more realistic about addressing the fundamental problems of how the founding of institutions of law actually happens. They are realistic. They give us a reasonable picture of this. So Gary Cooper founds it at the point of a gun. Of course, Westerns, they don't recall or describe the colonization from the point of view of Native Americans. Instead, they tell the story that America liked to tell about itself, about its origins, and about its transition to modernity. And we aren't talking, by the way, about some interior psychological development. The stories that Americans found most interesting were set in public arenas like the gunfight at the OK Corral, which, by the way, if you go to the town that's set in, they recreate that every day. Every day they have a tourist recreation of that scene. Okay, and what about colonialism, Glover? You haven't mentioned it once. Don't worry, the next video will look at Hegel and what he said about colonialism. Okay. Oh, by the way, you're a no-good low-down Yankee. Who was that? What film was from? Shane. Alan Ladd says it. Okay? That's the pop quiz. See you later.